So here we go, the first episode of Parentsitting. My inspiration for doing this honestly came after speaking with so many people over the last couple of years that were also dealing with parents or loved ones in some state of cognitive decline. And it was not only very eye opening for me, but in some sense, it made me feel less alone and not as if what I was going through was so abnormal. Everyone had these shared experiences, right? Shame, guilt, not doing enough, fear of the unknown, managing your parents' lives, the possibility of financial burdens, managing a house and finances that are not yours. And in some cases, but not mine, battling over family members about what should be done, right? But these were all the types of things I heard from other people and also personally felt. And it gave me some comfort, I think, just knowing that other people were experiencing this or have in the past. So, what I'm trying to do here on Parentsitting is be honest, open, and as vulnerable as I can be. And I think anyone that knows me knows that the latter may be the most difficult. And even though I've lived a very public life for many years, I tend to be a very private person. But another reason I wanted to do this is because I feel like it will also be a form of therapy for me and hopefully for others of you out there as well. I think what we all need is a place and a time to vent because I think this entire process is undoubtedly mentally draining for all of us. And I know in my case, there have been and still are many times that I feel overwhelmed with the fact that I'm trying to keep my parents' lives in order while at the same time trying to keep my own life in check. I also know that hearing the stories of friends and sometimes strangers truly helped me gain a better perspective of what we were all dealing with and has provided some solace for me in this journey. And because of that, I think all of us certainly need a space to vent. I've heard stories of how families have been torn apart because they can't even agree on what steps need to be taken to help someone with dementia. And I guess this is a good time to say that I'm using the word dementia because that's what both my parents are dealing with. But really, I think what we're talking about is anyone that has significant cognitive decline, something that requires someone from the outside to step in and provide guidance or assistance. One of my major hesitations about attempting a podcast at this specific time is that both my parents are still alive. And as you can imagine, I debated whether or not it was disrespectful to put their lives in a public forum, whether anyone ever listens or not. I knew that I was putting their business out there, which even at this point, I'm not sure I'm still okay with. But the bottom line, I thought this real time experience that I'm going through was important to share and might be helpful to others. So, enough about me and my purpose here. Let's go into how all this came about for me. What were the early signs that something was changing, yet I had zero clue it was happening right in front of me? One of the early signs, which I've come to realize, and there were many, started with mail. And yes, just regular everyday mail that gets delivered to your house. And it's not the when Harry met Sally kind of mail. This was more like the United States Postal Service decided they didn't want to deliver mail for a year and then dumped it all in my parents' house. That's how much mail I was dealing with. A few years ago, I would come back and visit my parents in Michigan. And I started to notice that there would be a few piles of mail on the kitchen table. Initially, I would say it was maybe 40, 50 pieces of mail. Some of it was open, some of it was unopened. And just to give you some context, it was strange because my mom was always the person that had to have a spotless house when visitors were expected. And that included me and my brother after we had gotten older and moved out. Everything had to be just perfect, no mess, vacuum floors, everything dusted. For those of us of a certain age, my mom would say it had to be spick and span, spick and span. Um, that's an old person term. And I had no idea what the hell that meant, but I knew everything had to be clean and spotless. So when I started seeing things that were not spick and span, like this male randomly covering the kitchen table, it was pretty odd. After several times of coming back to visit them, I noticed there were always just more and more mail everywhere. And after about 2 years of all this starting, it had gotten to the point where mail was literally covering the entire kitchen table, let's say about 7 feet long and maybe 3 feet wide. There was mail scattered across the kitchen island, mail covering the desk in an office, the floor of an office, and even a little nook in the kitchen. It was literally like a version of Hoarders, but only if the version of mail hoarders, just mail everywhere. So at this point, I'm literally starting to lose it because I started asking, why is there mail all over the house? And somehow my parents, got frustrated and mad at me for bringing it up, as if I'm not supposed to notice that there's hundreds of pounds of mail all over the house. My mom asked me why I'm being so critical and to basically say I was out of line for complaining about the mail. All of this eventually leads to me spending almost all of my last 8 to 10 trips to see them before we finally moved them out of their house, going through several hundred pieces of mail because I realized at this point potentially how many important notices are likely not being responded to. And to give you a visual perspective, I went out and bought a pack of those big, hefty lawn bags, and I ended up having probably a couple of 100 pounds of mail that were ultimately, you know, were all opened by me by hand to see what possibly was missed or needed a response. Most of it was taken to FedEx or UPS facility. I had to shred obviously all the financial stuff and things like that. And the other I just kind of tossed into a trash bin. But what's crazy on my part is that at no point did I think my parents were having cognitive issues. I honestly just assumed they were being lazy, didn't want to deal with the mail for whatever reason. But it led to these constant battles for a handful of years. I'd wake up in the mornings and start grabbing piles of mail, opening each envelope one by one to see what needed to be done. You can't imagine. You can imagine the things I found. Right, notices of power being turned off, cell phones being turned off, late notices for almost everything. I found that my dad owed a bill on a house in Louisville. There was a lien on that house for not paying taxes. Later, there was a lien on their house in Michigan because they decided they didn't want to pay their HOA for 3 years. And then my dad later said to me, I don't want to pay that stuff. He said, what's it for? And I said, well, mind you, they had paid it for the previous 20 years that they were in this house with no issues. So I explained why we're going to pay it. I won't go into all the financial miscues right now. I'll save that for a time down the road. But once I started opening the mail, I realized their problem was also a major issue. There was a problem managing finances, which ultimately led to me to really taking over virtually every aspect of their lives. But it was the mail that was really the first sign, albeit unknowing to me at the time. And really, there are tons of early signs that we can go into over time, but some of the ones I've heard about and that I saw on my own were things like managing finances, balancing checkbooks, paying bills on time or paying the bills at all, following conversations, within those conversations, repeating the same story or asking the same question without even noticing it. So keeping track of schedules also was a problem, or plans and dates of things became blurred, forgetting people's birthdays, things like that. I think the response that we have sometimes is important as well. What I didn't do well in the first few years was respond to my parents' issues with the proper patience and understanding. And from what I have gathered in my conversations with others, is that our initial response is not usually one of compassion and understanding, primarily because we have no damn idea what is happening right in front of our very own eyes especially early on, right? But our response, if you're the kid or even a spouse, is typically one of just annoyance and frustration. I know for me that I 100% did not handle these early stages well, primarily because I was clueless. And even once I knew something was wrong, I often let my anger and frustrations and emotions get the best of me. I can't tell you how many times we had screaming matches on the phone over just random stuff. My mom hanging up on me because she thought I was, butting into their business or asking questions I didn't need to ask. I found myself having more and more contentious conversations with my parents. However, I should say at this point, though, I've always had a good relationship with my parents. I love them dearly. They gave everything they had to make sure me and my brother were put in situations where we could be successful in life. And, they always verbalized they would do anything to help us, whether it be emotionally or financially, even at times when, we were younger and they couldn't afford maybe all the things they wanted to provide. But remember, at this point, I haven't come to the realization that this is part of a burgeoning problem. And it kind of progressively got worse, from the mail to dozens of other issues that came up over the last few years to where I sit with them today. They're no longer in their home. I have people taking care of them, driving them, but those are things we can kind of all get into. And, I think in these future episodes, what I want to do is share my stories because I know they are likely not drastically different from yours. I want to share all the signs that I witnessed of because there's so many. It's just that the majority of them, in my parents' case, were just cast off as normal aging issues. But it's not until there is this accumulation of signs that I think we start to say to ourselves, Houston, we've got a problem. So I also want to make sure that I share what this has been like for me emotionally, because I think for all of us, that's really the most difficult part to manage. And once you are in this knee deep, it's a 24-hour a day journey without any real end in sight. So that is it for this first episode. And don't forget, if you want to share your own stories or ask me questions, you can email them to parentsittingpodcast@gmail.com. And something I started to tell myself as I became more aware is to hug them, love them, and give them the patience and grace they once gave us.